Hello, I'm standing near the Pennsylvania historical marker that notes the occurrence of the Fishing Creek Confederacy. The marker, located in the borough of Benton, Pennsylvania, tells the story of hundreds of federal troops that were deployed here about 18 miles south of here in Columbia County, Pennsylvania during the latter part of the Civil War. Those soldiers were ordered to investigate, detain, and suppress opposition to the draft and the work of peace Democrats in the area during the summer into the fall of 1864. Hundreds were interrogated. Altogether, 44 citizens were imprisoned in Fort Mifflin in Philadelphia without access to civil trials. One person, William Roberts, would die while imprisoned. The episode represented a division of sentiments during the Civil War that surrounded the war effort: unionism, abolition, Abraham Lincoln, conscription, and political partisanship in this very rural area. The occurrence would continue to divide Columbia County for years, as many of the families passed down the animosity through their descendants, and the county histories would be developed in part by some of the participants. Much of the information and subsequent division that occurred out of these incidents were related in the partisan newspapers of Columbia County. The Democratic newspapers included the Columbia Democrat and the Star of the North, and the Republican was aptly called the Columbia County Republican. It is important for us to tell this story as a series of factual events and not as a legacy of division, even though that this is part of the story. I'm standing near the Raven Creek Presbyterian Church. The events that we now call the Fishing Creek Confederacy have their roots here. As a nation was embroiled in the Civil War, the federal government ordered the conscription of citizens across the country through the Enrollment Act. Resistance to this law was very strong in Columbia County, as it was in other places in Pennsylvania. Columbia County was a bulwark of Democratic sentiment for decades by the 1860s. John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, and George McClellan in 1864 overwhelmingly carried the county presidential elections in 1860 and 1864 respectively. Anti-abolitionist sentiment was rampant, and many blamed abolitionists for the war and its conduct. As a result, many people in this area of Columbia County failed to report after receiving notices of being drafted. This led to rumors of northern Columbia County citizens hiding out in a mysterious fort at North Mountain, about 10 miles north of here. This led some people to take law in their own hands by searching for deserters and draft resistors. One such instance of this took place in this area as a Lieutenant John Stuart Robinson and several other men came from neighboring Luzerne County looking for deserters. These men must have known the small town news of which families and individuals did not approve of the war draft, so Robinson and his posse were probably not just blindly searching. On the evening of July 30th, 1864, the posse crossed into Columbia County looking for deserters from the previous September's notice. They had no luck in finding anyone until they arrived near Raven Creek and came to the house of Tommy Smith. Smith, a deserter, was startled by his dogs, escaped while his wife apparently blew a horn to warn other neighbors of the posse. While on foot, Smith came across his brother Minor and a family friend by the name of Ellis or Elias Young. The trio armed themselves by nearby Aaron Smith's house and came into contact with the posse. At this point, accounts vary, but shots were exchanged and Lieutenant Robinson was wounded. Robinson would die a few months later. This episode would cause a chain reaction that would eventually lead to Union troops coming to investigate the widespread claims of violence and draft resistance. Near this spot, about 100 federal troops arrived by rail from Harrisburg to these fairgrounds on August 13, 1864. The Bloomsburg Fair had started as an agricultural exhibition for local farmers and eventually craftsmen and women to display their wares. It was a logical place for soldiers to camp due to its space, proximity to water, Fishing Creek is just over here, and the location from the northern parts of Columbia County, as the soldiers would follow Fishing Creek or any of the roads north. However, their arrival did spark some public concern. The Democratic newspaper, the Star of the North, speculated that perhaps their purpose was to, quote, intimidate Democrats, arrest drafted men, or to make abolitionists of this country feel more secure in their lives and property. The article also implied that there were too many chances for these drafted men to make their escape in the rural mountains of central Pennsylvania. However, the demeanor of the soldiers was described as conducting themselves as, quote, gentlemanly, as far as we have noticed, end quote. The soldiers, while on a mission to enforce the Enrollment Act, were ordered to not to straggle from the camp, as they were not allowed to leave camp without written permission. Soldiers were sent out on missions throughout the months leading up to the election to arrest violators of the Enrollment Act and to round up deserters. In the process, they would detain many Democrats before October 11th, which was the state election day, and were placed at the polls during election day in the various townships on October 11th. Bloomsburg was also a good place for commanding officers to confer with local leaders about rumors of deserters, secret meetings, suspected hideouts, and to get guides to northern Columbia County. It was also a hometown of U.S. Senator Charles Buckalew, a prominent Democrat and an opponent of many of Abraham Lincoln's war policies. Buckalew was home from Washington during the time of the soldiers' encampment. According to his accounts and that of local Democratic newspapers, he seemed to be only slightly kept in the loop and would spend much time decrying the events that would unfold. Another prominent Democrat, lawyer and member of the governor's staff, serving as lieutenant colonel, was John Fries. He was kind of a contact and offered up to guide a group of troops to prove to them that there were no violent dissenters and to prove that there were no hideout for draft evaders. From the fairgrounds, the troops spread out to conduct searches, interrogations, and arrests in the northern part of the Columbia County. It was from this vantage point 44 civilians were arrested and sent to Fort Mifflin near Philadelphia, which today is a 2.5-hour drive. Conditions at Fort Mifflin were considered to be poorly ventilated and damp. The barracks lacked sufficient windows or working fireplaces. Foul smells emanated from the moat that was clogged with vegetable matter. Diseases such as typhoid and dysentery affected the prisoners. It was at Fort Mifflin where William Roberts, a farmer from Benton, would die from these conditions, as reported from his fellow prisoner James McHenry. McHenry related the death of Roberts to the two Democratic newspapers as being from the squalid conditions at Fort Mifflin. Roberts would be interred at the Philadelphia and then in Philadelphia, and then supposedly moved to the Waller's Cemetery in northern Columbia County, where he and his wife may have been buried without any markers. In his letter to the editor, McHenry lamented the fact that as of October 1864, none of the prisoners had the benefit of a trial. I'm standing at the grave of John Rance. Rance was a farmer who was in his 60s at the time of the troops' arrival in Columbia County. A day after the arrival of the troops in Bloomsburg, dozens of men held a meeting at Rance's barn just southeast of here in Stillwater, Pennsylvania. Some of the attendees were draft evaders, others were citizens who were concerned about being drafted, or friends and families and at the risk of being drafted. Estimates were that between 100 and 125 people drifted in and out of the meeting at Rance's barn throughout August 14th. Some participants showed up armed and advocated for armed resistance. And fiery speeches also advocated for this type of situation as well. While others remained to be vigilant in monitoring troop movements and where they would end up being located as they were looking to arrest people. In the end, the barn meeting at John Rance's farm proved to be very incriminating, including many of the attendees were arrested, including Rance himself, and became prisoners. During his trial, Rance, along with Roar McHenry and Samuel Klein, who were also buried in the cemetery in Benton, Pennsylvania, were charged with creating a secret society known as the Knights of the Golden Circle. While there is no real evidence of such a society existing, Rance and McHenry would serve over 6 months in prison at Fort Mifflin. Over my shoulder rises Knob Mountain, where after many of the prisoners at Fort Mifflin had returned, there were other prominent Democrats, along with the former prisoners, who met in August into September of 1865 in order to reaffirm the ideals they felt had been violated as of the events of 1864. The several days' worth of speeches by dignitaries such as U.S. Senator Buckalew, Colonel John Freese, and Colonel Welling Ent of the 6th Pennsylvania Reserves. The reserves, commanded by Colonel Ent himself, provided picket duty for these meetings as the participants in the 3 days meetings and speakers slept in, quote, military style in tents being woken by reveille. The meetings were depicted by a reporter in the Columbia Democrat to have been almost like a religious revival, having a religious revival flair, being opened by prayer and having fiery speakers that espouse democratic principles from Thomas Jefferson by even reading his first inaugural address to open the proceedings. Reporting on the state Democratic Convention and a defense of the civilians that were detained at Fort Mifflin were also on the agenda. It was this subject, the Fort Mifflin situation, that seemed to be a topic that closed the assembly, as about 30 of the victims of the imprisonment were on the platform with Colonel John Freese as he narrated the events of August and September of 1864. He derided the lack of evidence, trial and inhumane treatment of the men. Later, Freese would help create a historiography of sorts of this whole situation, as he would write 2 separate volumes of Columbia County history and would depict what we know now as the Fishing Creek Confederacy as a, quote, invasion of Columbia County, end quote. Colonel John Freese, whose headstone I am standing by, is buried here in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, near U.S. Senator Charles Buckalew. Freese and Buckalew are important figures not only as Democratic leaders in the 1860s, but also in helping to shape the legacy of the Fishing Creek Confederacy. In the succeeding years after the Civil War, Freese would detail the events of the summer and fall of 1864 in his 2 histories of Columbia County as ones that pitted powerful partisan politics against poor Democratic farmers. Buckalew would also use his prominence, to question the tactics of the troops as well as support the prisoners who were detained in Fort Mifflin. After the Civil War, the Supreme Court would declare in Ex parte Milligan that that military tribunals to try civilians would be unconstitutional. For the 43 surviving prisoners, this would be a decision too late in coming, in that many of them were released from prison, most times without the benefit of a trial, and 7 others were either released by general orders or by presidential pardons by Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. The Fishing Creek Confederacy narrative would come full circle in 1891 when the trial of Ellis Young in the murder of Lieutenant Robinson, which started the whole situation to begin with, ended in a not guilty verdict. The lessons of this historic episode are important. They need to be related to succeeding generations of warnings of government power gone awry, but also the danger of trying to upset the existing political order. Columbia County, Pennsylvania, as well as the rest of the country, can all look to the Fishing Creek Confederacy as a testament to those lessons.